Hey, welcome to this open hour where we're going to be talking about music theory, and all that goes with it. And that is, if there are any questions in the chat. If there's not, I'm just going to be working on some stuff here off to the side, as is the case. I don't have any planned presentation, but I'm keeping my eye on the chat and then can address a couple of questions that I've seen elsewhere as well. So we can just jump right in. I'm getting a feel for glasses. I've never needed glasses until like the last year, so I'm getting used to it. Okay, we have a question from Richard. Richard, thank you for your support here on locals. And let's address your question because it's a good one. So you said, I want to buy the color patches for guitar, but can they be put on a 5-string bass? So that's a great question. So the labels here are, let me just jump into, the short answer is no, I don't believe so. And let me talk through kind of the reason behind that. So the guitar labels are, never tried this under this camera, so let's see how it goes. Okay, so the reason being is that if you can see here, that the acoustic and electric 6-string labels, the labels for an acoustic and or electric guitar, are have a certain width. So the width of the fret, you can see that each note is aligned with the strings. Now, different fretboards, I'm still here, different fretboards have different dimensions, but I've measured at least over 100 guitars over time and have found that within a certain margin of error, most guitars, most 6 strings fall within those dimensions. So these labels work well for the vast majority of 6 strings. When it comes to bass strings, so if you have a bass guitar, let's say that we chop off this top string and we're left with 5 frets, you're going to have different dimensions. The bass labels, bass fretboards, I should say, tend to be a bit wider. They can range quite a bit. In fact, I've done measurements for bass labels like I have here, and I've measured lots and lots of bass guitar fretboards for that, and found actually more variation in bass guitars. And so in my design of the bass labels for 4-string, though, the bass labels are designed for a 4-string bass, there's a wider range. And so finding that average was a bit more challenging, but should work. So anyway, all that to say, thank you for your support. And it's a great question. The 6-string labels aren't designed to work with a 5-string bass. If you were to, also another factor is if you were to snip off this one, if you were to snip one of the top, the note that goes with the top strings, what I'm trying to say, the labels are designed, you can't really see because it's clear, but the labels actually wrap around the side of the, maybe you can see a little bit right there, wrap around the side of the neck to hold it in place, so that as you run your hand along the side, it doesn't snag it and peel it up. And because it's a very gentle adhesive, so it's not like, it needs that wraparound to really have a good hold. So if you snip off one of the notes for a 5-string, even if the dimensions were correct, there's more of a chance that it could peel up. So that is the case with the 5-string. But on the topic of at least the 4-string bass, that is something I have on the list of to-do items that I'm looking forward to finishing up and getting the bass labels done. The finishing part 5 of the course has definitely engrossed and taken up virtually every moment of my time, not only my creative time, but my non-creative time. It's taken over. That, and also the accompanying or the supplementary chord and mode books that are enrich the Part 5 experience. So I'm getting close to having those completed, which is awesome. I'm actually working on the mode book right now. Was working on that this morning. Finished chord books 1 and 2. Though as I've worked on each successive chord book or mode book, I've been like, oh, okay, actually there's an adjustment or a correction that I need to make on the previous ones. So it's like baking a cake. Once you get the cake out of the oven, you don't put the frosting on right away because it needs to cool. If you try to apply frosting to a this is a metaphor for why I'm kind of letting each PDF sit after I finish it, because I find that the corrections are needed. It's like if you were to apply icing to a cake right out of the oven, it's going to turn into a mush ball because it's still moist and hot and soft and all that. So kind of like setting it in the fridge to let it cool a bit and then put the icing on the top and get those out there. So I'm excited for that. This light is way too bright. So just one sec, let me adjust that so I can not glint. So yeah, that's a great question, Richard. Thank you for your question. Definitely a lot of buildup of things, of projects that have just kind of been on hold as I've been working on this course, including a lot of posts that I'm excited to add here on locals to have music fill the air. It's been a bit quiet on the back end as I've just been racing to complete all these materials, but it's coming along. So as always, I'll keep my eye on the chat to address any questions that may come up. If it's a quiet open hour, that's sometimes the case, so that's fine. There were a couple of comments on some posts elsewhere that I thought might be interesting to talk through. So I'm going to pull one of those up. So one of them, actually, this is funny because this was what I was going to address in an upcoming stream. BlackMath69 had commented that so I did a recent video about When I'm 64, the Beatles song When I'm 64 from the 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's, which is an excellent album in total. And that song actually is a really good song. It has, like an old time music hall vibe. So, a lot of people might consider it not cool to like that song. It has, like a jaunty old school vibe. But BlackMath69 said that D flat, because the song is in, it moves between D flat Ionian, and then the chorus is in B flat Aeolian. So it goes from, even though they share the same group of notes, it moves between the Ionian mode and its relative, or the major D flat major, and its relative B flat Aeolian mode. Same grouping, different modes. So the comment here was D flat / B flat minor is the same key. It is not modal mixture. A modal mixture would be parallel modes with the same tonic, borrowing chords from D flat Mixolydian or D flat Dorian, etc. You don't borrow chords from the same key. So it's an interesting point about borrowing chords and using the term borrowed chords and modal mixture. And you could say that that relative modes, to move between relative modes, is not modal mixture. And it is the same set of chords, and it is the same key signature if you're thinking of it in terms of music notation and the key signature indicating that they're the same group. However, you are moving between modes in the sense that you can hear it in the song, that it is definitely switching between a jaunty so that's definitely Ionian, and then the chorus is so it's like definitely changing vibes. It's definitely from Ionian to Aeolian. By the way, I say Aeolian. For the longest time, I used to pronounce it Aeolian until I looked it up, and it is Aeolian, technically, is the correct pronunciation. So you're moving from a relative Ionian to a relative Aeolian. And while they're the same keys, I don't know if I use the term borrowed actually in that context, because it's true that you don't borrow chords from the same group. So when I talk about borrowed chords, I like to speak or use like an analogy of, or a metaphor of, if you're baking cookies, say you're at home and you're baking some cookies and you're like, I ran out of flour. And so I need some flour. Instead of, driving all the way to the grocery store that might be miles away, like, I already preheated the oven, want to, get some quick and easy flour. I'm just going to walk over to my neighbor's house, knock on the door, and borrow some flour. You're not going to give it back. It's going to make its way into the cookies, but you might say, hey, you can have some cookies when I'm done. So borrowing, the idea of borrowing is that it's within reach. And so when I talk about borrowed chords, and I talk about this in lesson 19 in the course, I do talk about parallel modes. So if you were to borrow chords, you're reaching to your neighbor's house outside of just your home. So in the context of relative movement between a relative Ionian and a relative Aeolian, you're in the same house. So the flour is in the same cupboard, right? Like if you want to bake cookies, like to use that metaphor of baking cookies with flour, you are using the same group. So I wouldn't necessarily use the term borrowed chords in the context of movement between relative modes. So that point is correct. Black Math 69 is correct about that. As far as modal mixture, you definitely are mixing modes in the sense that the song is shifting back and forth between Ionian and Aeolian, or a major key in the verse and a minor key in the chorus. And to me, if I was to describe juxtaposing or putting together different modes, what's a word for that? Mixture. I would call that modal mixture. Now, some might argue that technically that terminology is not correct. But again, I think coming at it from the paradigm of a key signature, that those two major and minor keys share the same key signature, I think might be clouding the way that it's thought of when in practicality you're mixing modes. So hopefully that makes sense. And it's a thoughtful comment and a good one to address. Let's see. Okay. I am looking at another comment here. Okay, so there's actually a comment. It's on the most recent live stream so just as a rule, I typically just don't respond to comments on YouTube, especially right now, because I'm not really focusing on anything but getting the course and these chord and mode books done. And so, any commentary and conversation happens really here on Locals. So again, thank you for your support. There was one that I skimmed through, had a lot of interesting notes. Alphanumeric had an interesting comment and interesting comments. It was a lot of notes here, but one of the questions was just in terms of the Beatles advance, because I kind of spoke to the Beatles progression from, I mean, I get at this, the Beatles in particular in lesson 19, as an example. I use the Beatles a lot as an example because I love the Beatles, but they're really just representative, these concepts of all musicians, including ourselves, on our progress towards excellence, right? And the Beatles are just such an astounding example because their progression was so remarkably fast. To Alphanumeric's comment, which was, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't score with my understanding of how the human mind and even a band collective mind works in terms of how quickly the Beatles advanced. Because like if you if you look at 1963, for example, you know, they're coming out with songs like, well, Love Me Do was 1962, I think, but around that time, to even just 4 years later, 1967, you've got A Day in the Life. I mean, it is remarkable. It's almost impossible to this comment. So the question is, were the drugs better back then? Did they get a download from a UAP or the netherworld, perhaps? Are the muses, in fact, and after all, real? Did they achieve enough success with their pretty boy faces and masterful marketing that somebody dished out for the deeply talented phantom songwriters to write further works, realizing the simple blues ripoffs were a dead end, potentially too infringing? I jest a bit, but I'd really like to wrap my head around this. I mean, if such a transition is naturally possible, well, then I suppose I could have that transition in the last few months. So it's a great question, series of questions and points about the Beatles. So let's talk a bit about that. Alphanumeric, if you're part of the community here on Locals, thank you. And hopefully this addresses some of your points. So, okay, Sam, I'm getting used to whether I kind of like naturally go towards glasses now, which has been a change for me over the last, I don't know, 6 to 8 months. So the Beatles are truly remarkable, and no, on the question of did they just, you know, hire some phantom writers as fill-ins behind the scenes. Even if you hear some of their earlier works, like Paul McCartney has a song, it was like the first song he wrote, I think when he was 14, called I Lost My Little Girl. It's woke up late this morning, my head was in a whirl. It's only then I realized I lost my little girl. There's actually a really good version of that on Paul McCartney's Unplugged from like 1994 or something. And it has actually a similar theme, speaking of the Beatles and Paul McCartney, to Let It Be. So when people hear the song Let It Be, he says, you know, Mother Mary whispers words of wisdom, let it be. A lot of people, not knowing his personal history, hear that and think, oh, that's Mother Mary, you know, like of Christian fame, you know, like he's it's a Christian reference is what a lot of people interpret it as, when he said, no, actually my own mother's name was Mary McCartney. And so and she died when he was like 14. So for him to have a dream of his mother saying it's okay, like if you're dealing with problems, it was like his own personal experience and a dream of his mother giving him comfort. And so the song I Lost My Little Girl was, you know, a reference to his mother had just died. And so he was dealing with that. And so that song when he was 14 is actually a really good melody. It's a really good song. And even the song When I'm 64, Paul McCartney claims that he came up with the melody when he was 16 and then fleshed out the song and included it on Sgt. Pepper's a few years later. So they had the nascent talent and ability very early on. And I get at this in the course, like in lesson, I think 12 or 13, how remarkable it is that they were able to collect this mental database of like this vast repertoire of songs, of cover songs, where they went from consumers taking in all of these things to producers putting out all of these amazing pieces of art. And that is, I mean, that right there is what inspired me to delve into music theory and to try to crack the code of music theory and the development of color music, to try to wrap my head around what seems like an impossible feat to advance so quickly. And as you get into the Beatles songs, and I mean, literally look at them, to look inside, peek behind the curtain, or open up the hood and look inside the music theory at play. One thing, when you realize that, and I get at this in like, I think it was like lesson 14 or 15, that it is, once you see that what they're working with, that it is not just a random bunch of chords and you just kind of string them together haphazardly and poof, or voila, music pops into the air. You have a major advantage in that music is your co-pilot, or maybe even you are music's co-pilot, and it is guiding you, because there is definitely a method to the madness. And so that is one of the key takeaways for me with music theory, is that once you realize that, oh, wow, there's this beautiful framework, this beautiful structure that is in essence a language. Once you become fluent in that language, you can create all sorts of poetry, musically speaking. And yeah, so it wasn't phantom songwriters, it was the Beatles. It wasn't, people behind the scenes creating the art for them. It was them cracking the code themselves in their own way. Hey, Doc Ron Bean, music for the health of it. Love it. Thank you for being here, by the way, and for your support here on Locals. So really appreciate all of your videos. You're so right. Beatles forever. Yeah, I love the Beatles. It's funny. There is a book called Beatles Forever. Just your comment reminded me of that when I was a teenager, my older brother, who's like, a few years older than me, gave me, like for Christmas or something, he gave me the book Beatles Forever, which was kind of like a precursor to Anthology, but not by the Beatles themselves. And he joked in his note, I remember he said, Beatles Forever. And he has kind of a sly sense of humor. He was like, next year, I guess it's going to be Led Zeppelin Forever, as if to say I was going to progress past the Beatles, which I took slight offense to, because it's I like Led Zeppelin, but man, the Beatles are truly amazing. And Led Zeppelin's awesome too, but the Beatles are craftsmen beyond craftsmen. They are true artists in their knowledge of and mastery of weaving together chords. And their mastery of chords, again, is based on this objectively accessible framework. The accessibility of music theory, I think, was the most difficult thing for me, is what how can music be accessible? It's fluent to my ears, but foreign to my eyes. Hey, Virtuous Heretic. Personally, I've read and lived enough that their fast preparation does not strike me as impossible. Yeah, that's actually well said. That and with enough life experience, and like whether it's musically or just in other ways, like when you kind of like learn to figure things out, sometimes by necessity, where it's just like, baptism by fire, where you're just like, I got to figure this out. You kind of just figure it out. And so, yeah, it's definitely not impossible. Far from it, actually. Although it is remarkable. Not impossible, but remarkable. You said, I mean, if you're highly focused on something and spend most of your time being on it, it's incredible what one can learn / do / create in just a year or two. It's totally remarkable. Scientists talk about the plasticity of the mind, especially when you're young, that, to learn a foreign language, it's especially beneficial to learn a foreign language when you're, I don't know, what is it, like under the age of 8 or something. It's, if you have like, especially, children who grow up in bilingual homes or environments, that they become fluent in multiple languages much more easily. And part of it is just because their world, there isn't a reason to question what you're hearing and understanding, because it's like this this insular reinforcement of all of these concepts. And I think though that you can, even though plasticity might be especially flexible at a younger age, like even as I've gotten older, like I think it's remarkable the Beatles did what they did when they were in their 20s. But as I've gotten older, I'm well past my 20s, I'm in my 40s, and I feel like, even to use language, not even as a metaphor, literally music is a language, that as I've become more fluent in the language of music theory over the years, it's like I've been able to like pick up a lot of information, and I feel like my mind is as plastic as ever when it comes to learning that language. Virgil Tarek, at one time your brother's, yes, yeah, this is true. One time my brother's license plate was Z3JTAE or 38 or something. Yeah, that's exactly what it was. So a car in front looking in a rear view mirror would read it Beatles. Yeah, that is what it is. This is, I think I mentioned this in the last week's open hour. This is the same brother who sold his first art piece to Ripley's Believe It or Not museum. It was truly amazing. I still have, I don't know. I hope I have a picture of that art piece. I'll have to find it. It was super cool, and see if he's cool with me sharing that image. But yeah, the idea of the Beatles being seen in a rearview mirror, it was like perfectly representative of the idea of like the Beatles playing, inventing and reinventing music with backwards loops and all of that. Like that's so cool that the Beatles played with backwards stuff, and then to take that message and just that concept, and even just to create a license plate that is more beneficial to someone else on the road is interesting. That is art. Like art, you can create art in all sorts of areas. Actually, I just finished a great book. I read this before, but it had been a minute since I read it again, which is The Icarus Deception by Seth Godin. It's a short read. All of his books, if you don't know Seth Godin, he is really good. He's an author that he writes. I think he compiles his books as they're like compilations of blog posts that he does on the internet. And so they're kind of like bite-sized. It's not like a novel where it reads fluidly from, chapter A to Z. It's more like just ideas that are build on a general theme. And so each book has a general theme. Anyway, the Icarus Deception, the idea is that, the ancient myth of, was it Daedalus, who, yeah, he was in the Greek myth of Daedalus, that he was an inventor. He was a creator who was trying to escape some island, I think. And so he invented this pair of wings that had actual feathers that were made of wax and feathers that he put on his back and strapped to his son's arm. His son was Icarus. And so they flew off the island to escape, and they're flying over the ocean because it's Greece, and Greece is islands and oceans. And he said, hey, be very careful. Daedalus said to Icarus, be very careful. Don't fly too high. If you fly too high towards the sun, Apollo will be offended, and your wings will melt basically from the heat of rising so high. But at the same time, he also said, don't fly too low, because if you're too low to the waves, you'll get caught up in the sea foam and the mist and all of that, and you'll crash. And so Seth Godin's point is that the idea of the wings, of flying too high to the sun. So the famous phrase is, don't fly too high. Don't fly too close to the sun, I think is how people say it. And so basically it's like, don't get ahead of yourself or reach too high. You should kind of like temper your aspirations and just kind of play it safe. But people forget that the flip side of Daedalus's admonishment to his son Icarus was, don't fly too low. So don't play it too safe. Don't hide under any rock, as it were, in life. And so anyway, in the Icarus Deception, I'm kind of like going off on a tangent here, but in the Icarus Deception, he also talks about, Seth Godin talks about art, that everything you do should be art in some kind of way. And not everything, like you don't have to like, turn every single thing you do into an artistic piece, because you have to kind of like manage your resources and time and effort. But even in seemingly mundane or meaningless things, or things that other people won't necessarily even notice, you can make it art. It's totally true. And I think even just turning your license plate into, that's how I even got on that tangent, is that to turn your license plate into art is art. It's like a beautiful thing. Verge of Terror, you said, curious mind can make many new connections rapidly. Yeah, curiosity. And that's like Einstein talked about. He said there's no such thing as genius. I'm just intensively curious, or something. I'm paraphrasing, but yeah, curiosity did not kill the cat. Again, that's another, don't fly too close to the sun. Curiosity killed the cat. Those are two statements that I think are nefarious, and that they're meant to keep people down, when really you should reach and create art, and you should have curiosity. It's not going to kill you in either sense. Totally. Oh, thank you that's excellent book. I highly recommend it. It's really good. It's actually a pretty quick read. There's an audio version too. I tend to listen to audiobooks, especially as I'm working on the course and the PDFs, that I don't really have the ability to stop and read something, but I do listen to the audio, and it's super awesome. I actually recently found out that Spotify has an audiobook section, which I think is relatively new. I highly recommend that. There's Audible as well, if you're in any other places where fine audiobooks are sold. Daedalus is also in the Percy Jackson series. If you don't know the Percy Jackson series, definitely check it out. They those stories weave together and bring in Greek mythology and modernize it to make it accessible and relatable and relevant to today's mind. We're trying to find 15 minutes a day to read a book together. That isn't on audio. Struggling to find it. Yeah, exactly. Even 15 minutes. There's this book that we both are interested, Virtuous Heretic and I are wanting to read. I found, well, actually you found this audiobook on YouTube, but it's just like, it's a free, because it's an old book. It's not in the public, or it is in the public domain. And it's hard because thankfully someone recorded it for free. It's on YouTube. But the flip side of the freeness of it is that it's a difficult listen, because audio narrators can be hit and miss, and this one was more of a miss for me. So I want to read this book, and if we can find 15 minutes, literally that is, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate. Like, life is especially full, but even 15 minutes of reading a book, we keep telling ourselves that once this part 5 is out, and once the PDFs and chord books are done, and we're back into a groove of, I'm so excited. Here on Locals, again, thank you so much for your support here. You literally make this possible for all that is going on right now, and you'll be seeing a lot of content posted here. Lots of good stuff in the works. I have found that funneling and focusing the juices and the energy is truly the way to push. It's turned out to be a boulder, a massive boulder, to finish part 5 and get these chord and mode books out. I seriously thought, like, when I first was looking at the boulder, I was like, okay, that boulder weighs 100 pounds. Like, I can give that a good shove and it'll just roll. And as I've come up next to it and been pushing it, it's more like 1,000 pounds. It's massive. I'm excited though, because part 5, getting into the fretboard matrix, chords inversions, modes, the permutations of these patterns, and then the circle of fifths, modal mixture, all of that is exciting. Like it's like my favorite part of music theory. So I'm excited to be jumping into that. Yeah, we're definitely not those types of people who get an ego boost / validation by being busy. No doubt. This is what it has to be like in order to hit these goals. Exactly. Yeah, I definitely, that's a good point. Is sometimes I'll hear people say how busy they are, and I'm like, cry me a river, like tell me about it. And sometimes I think they're doing it just because it sounds like it's cool, but literally it is. I was just saying this morning, like I feel like I've been in a submarine for an extended period of time, where I'm like, what do trees look like? And it's a metaphor, so because I'm looking out a window and I can see trees, but it's an interesting experience. Owl, hey, cool, thanks for being on. How can you best learn the names of notes in the intervals on the fretboard with the color coding? Okay, that's a great question. So let's talk about it. So, okay, so in part 1 of the course, fundamentals, gets into the names of notes, so letter names for notes and interval names or numbers for interval names. So you have these two sets of symbols, letters and numbers. And while I'm talking, I'm going to try to pull up if I have access. Oh, there might. Okay, yeah, hold on. I'm going to pull up some diagrams. Okay, here's one. Okay. That's one thing that I'm looking forward to having for these open hours is having like diagrams at the ready, where I have, just like this library, because I have thousands upon thousands of diagrams that I've been organizing. This is a tangent, pardon me. I'll get to your question, but just as an aside, the diagrams that I have are organized in the playlists and stuff, but have just the diagrams at the ready to pull up here to talk about is something that I've started on. But again, with the part 5 and the PDFs, that's been the focus. But that's something that's definitely going to help aid these conversations. But Owl, to your question. So this is a diagram, I think, from maybe lesson 4 in part 1. And it is, speaking of treating the fretboard like a chessboard, in that, the idea being that if you were to learn chess, it can be overwhelming to have all of the different chess pieces and just start playing. Like if you're just like, okay, go. And it's like, whoa, all of these different chess pieces have different abilities, different ways to move across the board. A knight can move like in an L shape in different directions. A bishop can move diagonally, and likewise for the other pieces. So the idea of using the geometry of a key and the different symmetrical relationships between notes to dissect the patterns on the fretboard is helpful. And so this diagram, for example, is taking the different geometric intervals of this is like a tritone. So this is a flat 5. This is a 4 and a 5. This is a 3 and a flat 6. This is a flat 3, and a 6. This is a flat 7 and a 2, and a 7 and a flat 2. And those are the same. These intervals, this geometry, the symmetry between notes is consistent across all 12 keys. This just happens to be in the key of C. So that's one thing, is when you first look at the fretboard, it can seem like this, like, whoa, overwhelming. Just like if you were to look at a chessboard with all of the pieces on there, you're like, how am I supposed to play this game? If I'm new to this game, that's too many pieces and too many options for movement. It's like too much. So if you think of it as a series of transparencies, an image that has, multiple, you have the trees and the house and the birds and the people and the the car, like all of these different transparencies have one of those elements on this piece of plastic. If you just remove some of the pieces of plastic and just look at the house, and then, okay, I've got a feel for the house. Now I'm going to put on another transparency on top and see, okay, there's a car next to the house. Okay. And then I'm going to build on that composite image of, I'm going to add the birds. Okay, there are birds flying through the air. Then I'm going to add the trees, and then I'm going to add the people. And that way you can take in the picture, take in this scene, and you're like, okay, I've been able to absorb this scene one layer at a time. So I'm using multiple metaphors, mixed metaphors of a composite image with different transparencies, or looking at the chess pieces on a board, one piece at a time. It's like that with the fretboard. When you first look at the fretboard with all of the colors and all of the notes, it's a lot. One thing that can also add to that potential sense of overwhelm is that the colors, due to the way that the colors, that this interlaced matrix of notes between each string represents a chromatic scale, and every fret, except for that shift in the top two strings, is a circle of fifths sequence. So I'm just kind of looking at a series of different, you can see how it's like a color wheel. It's like, color of a color wheel, almost like raindrops sliding down a glass window. Like you can see those streaks of color. And then you have every string is kind of this scrambled pattern where it's like you have red and then blue green, and then you have, or green blue, and then orange and blue purple and yellow. So each string is kind of this scrambled pattern because the chromatic scale is a rearrangement of the circle of fifths. It is literally a scrambled color wheel. And so at first you have, whoa, what am I looking at with these colors? Because it's like this scrambled array of colors. And with the notes, or the numbers, I should say, you have this 1 and a flat 2 and a 2 and a flat 7. The symbols seem kind of confusing. And so the colors and the numbers can be confusing. And so in lesson 4, and just part 1 as a whole, I recommend going through these diagrams where it's like just taking it in one pattern at a time. So you have, in the key of C, for example, C is red. So we have C, and we have, in this case, it's G flat is the flat 5, is just playing these patterns and rising up the fretboard, playing these patterns and getting a feel for, okay, tritones sound really bad. Like it's not going to be a musical exercise to go through and play those notes in sequence, but you're getting a feel for, okay, the tritones are laid out in this way. And this same concept and these diagrams for every key are shown. The same relative positioning of intervals applies for all keys. Then you go through and you play, okay, I'm going to play C, F, and G. And so on the fretboard, C is flanked by F and G. F is above, G is below. There's this shift in the top two strings, but the same concept holds. C is flanked by F and G. C is flanked by F and G. And so I'm going to play it on a keyboard, but the same idea applies to a fretboard. Okay, those notes are going to sound more pleasing. It's going to be a more pleasing exercise to play the 1, the 4, and the 5. And you can see that they are neighbors from the circle of fifths. They're harmonically related, and that's why it's going to sound good. Then you play C, E, and in this case, A flat, which form this perfect triangle of major thirds. And they have this other layout. So whereas the tritones slant up to the right, assuming you have you're right-handed and playing a right-handed guitar, the major thirds slant up to the left. And so it's going to sound somewhat satisfying. It's basically an augmented chord. You get a feel for that relationship. Now, hopefully this is in a way answering your question. So let me read your question again and see if I can speak to another aspect of it. So how can you best learn the names of the notes and the intervals on the fretboard with the color coding? So yeah, the names of the notes. So I'm talking about the patterns themselves and how the color, and really more of my examples here are with the numbers. because these numbers are universal in that the same intervals or the same number relationships are consistent from one key to the next. So in this example, 1 is C, and it's right here. 3 is E, and it's right there. Flat 6 is A flat, and it's right there. But if I just shift up a fret, so for example, I'm going to play C, E, and A flat. That's what that is showing right there. The notes are the letter names for the notes. The pitches are C, E, and A flat. But if I shift up a fret, I have D flat, F, and A. Now, the letter names change, but what's cool is the intervals, the relative position of those stay the same. So let me try to say that again. And like I say, it might be lesson 3 too that talks about names and numbers, letters and numbers, and how those apply. But we have C, E, and A flat, or D flat, F, and A. That's 6 different letters or 6 different notes that I just said there. C, E, and A flat, and D flat, F, and A. But if I refer to that same relationship in terms of the numbers or the intervals, it's 1, 3, and flat 6, or 1, 3, and flat 6. Way easier, because now I'm not trying to remember all of these different letter names. I'm just referring to the interval relationship. So down here I have, for example, A, D flat, and F. It's just a permutation of that. But the same relationship of 1, 3, and flat 6 is there. Up here I have D, F sharp, and A sharp, or 1, 3, and flat 6. So thinking of it in terms of the intervals is actually more useful. I think of the and speak of the letters and the numbers as being like training wheels on a bicycle, in that they help to get you up and running and keep your balance so you don't just crash and get hurt. In the same way that letters and numbers in music help your mind kind of make sense of things, but eventually training wheels are going to slow you down. They help you keep your balance on a bike, but at some point as you start to pedal faster, they're going to start to kind of like mess with your flow. Because if you want to once you get a feel for your balance and you're riding a bike, as you try to turn and ride and maybe go in the mountains on some dirt trails, now the asset of training wheels will become a liability because they're just going to get in the way. In the same way that letters and numbers, thinking in terms of letters and numbers is helpful in the beginning, because you can be like slowly playing C, E, and A flat, or 1, 3, and flat 6. But as you start to get a feel for it and understand these patterns, dissecting these patterns, just like we show here on a chessboard, you can start to let the training wheels of letters and numbers go. So I know I'm kind of like speaking past your question, in that you're saying, hey, how can I use these letters and numbers to get my bearings? And what I'm trying to say is use these patterns in part 1 to dissect the relationships one at a time, but with then the knowledge that at some point you can just transcend these symbols and just get a feel for that is the relationship. That is where your fingers go, because those notes are laid out in that way. Hopefully that makes sense. I know I feel like I'm not saying it as concisely as I could. So it seems you're saying memorize the shapes of the intervals and the names of the notes are training wheels. Yes. Yeah. Now, before I say yes, straight up yes to that, which is basically a yes, and I'll keep this diagram up because I think it's a helpful visual, is the names of the notes are helpful even even when you don't really need them, because they help in communicating with other musicians. So by that, I mean, they're ways to verbalize concepts. So I'm able to say to you, hey, C, E, and A flat. So it gives me a way to even just communicate that idea. So the letter names are helpful. They're always helpful, at least when you're talking with others. But I don't really think in terms. Yeah, I don't really think in terms of the letter names, because it would slow down my thinking. I can see the relationship. So yeah, in terms of the shapes of the intervals, is yes, to Virtuous Heretic's point, the letter names don't have the intrinsic meaning. Exactly, because what happened with music is that we had these invisible relationships between things, because music is this auditory art form, right? It's not something you can see traditionally pre-color music. And so it was just like, well, we had to slap some kind of label on top of the pitch to at least make it visible. It's like throwing paint on the invisible man, like just to like know what we're dealing with. The problem with letter names is that they were just kind of arbitrarily, it's just this man-made label that was slapped on. And so they're helpful in that they make the sound visible and communicable, if that's a word, but they can cause more confusion than clarity, because I think, and certainly the case for me, is I gave them more importance, like G sharp versus G. There must be, it's like, no, actually what matters is just the geometric relationship between those notes, that the colors truly communicate. What about using the color coding on the fretboard as a learning tool and then removing once the patterns are learned? That's a great question. And I've gotten this question before. So that definitely is something you can do. So like if I were to pick up a guitar that doesn't have labeling, like I can play it, like I can see where, like you can see where to go because you understand the relationships, which you can definitely do. So in other words, you're not locked in. Like once you have the labels, you're not, just like with training wheels, like once you get up and running, you can let the training wheels go. Now, in my training wheel metaphor, however, I'm referring to the letters and the numbers as the training wheels that can be discarded once you get up and running. For me personally, I prefer, like whether it's a guitar or on a keyboard, to still see the relationships, because the relationships are helpful. They're not, once you get a feel for them and you understand, I mean, Stevie Wonder is literally blind and he can play the keyboard, or they're, blind guitar players. And they have a feel for, they can see it within their mind's eye. And so, yeah, you could definitely do that. If that is how you want to go. I have found that the insights have never stopped in terms of the relationships and understanding movement on the fretboard. And so I love it, but at the same time, I can sit down at a keyboard or pick up a guitar that doesn't have the labels and navigate, because I have my bearings. Like I know where I'm going. Let's see. That's a great question. My gut on that would be that it's super personal to each artist. That's well said. That's in essence. And yeah, if you're colorblind, people who are colorblind, actually, if you're colorblind, color music has helped, because if anything, even just the shapes of the notes have helped. But yeah, once you get a feel for the relationships, that's the cool thing. So if you're jamming with friends, or if you're out, and just pick up a guitar and want to play, you can, which is what it's all about. Virtuous Heretic, it's like some people thrive in a more minimalistic Scandinavian homes, others like the maximalism. Yeah, that's well said. It's very well said. Yeah, to each his own. So practice lesson 4, any other lessons that help? Yeah, so I would say, let me see if I can pull up an overview of the course lessons. Hold on just one sec. If I can find, yes, perfect. Oops. Okay, hold on. Okay, so I say lesson 4, that diagram that we looked at, that diagram that we looked at with the chessboard is lesson 4. However, as tempting as it would be to skip to lesson 4, I would not recommend going straight to lesson 4 because every concept, you can see this is like a climb. Every concept builds and every lesson builds on the last. So if you go straight to lesson 4, as tempting as that would be, it would be potentially confusing. I mean, I would be confused because what I talk about in lesson 4 refers to lesson 3, and what I talk about in lesson 3 refers to lesson 2, and so on. So fundamentals, super helpful because the notes and the intervals are at the atomic level what everything builds upon. So most people, myself included, when I first got into music, I wanted to jump straight into chords. I was like, who needs to know intervals? Like what I just talked about with understanding and dissecting the fretboard like it's a chessboard. That was like way too much patience for me back in the day. Because I was like, well, if I know how to play an A chord and I know how to play a D minor, that's a cool progression. Who needs to know what the actual notes are? As long as my fingers can hit those spots, I'm good. But the shortcut was ultimately a detour because, the immediate gratification led to long-term pain because I didn't know why I was playing those notes and I didn't know how to maybe find those notes in different positions on the fretboard and play different inversions. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say I was tempted to jump straight into chords, part 5, which would be helpful for you as well. But that comes after lesson 4, but you need to know lesson 4 before you advance there. What I'm trying to say is just start at lesson 0 and make your way through each lesson in sequence. Fundamentals is very helpful. Chords is very helpful. Time starts getting more into the abstractions of time because music is a combination of rhythm and pitch. In other words, time and space. Rhythm is time and pitch is space, but musical space or harmonic space. And so time is very helpful, but it's more abstract in that it gets more into the heady aspects of time, and it gets into music notation, which for me was really important to dissect and dismantle notation because traditional notation has long been presented as the de facto method of learning, that if you don't know notation, you can't learn theory. And so it was this barrier that I had to break through for myself. And I feel like others would benefit from breaking out of the paradigm of notation. But notation is all about literally illustrating rhythm and pitch or space and time. And so, and I talk about this in lesson 8. I say in lesson 9, you can just skip 10 and 11 for the purposes of mastering the guitar if you'd like. And then composition builds on, again, the previous lessons, getting into the layers of music. So rhythm, harmony, melody, lyrics, and all of that. And it's putting all of these principles that you've learned up earlier on into practice. So it's one thing to learn something and gain the head knowledge, and it's another thing to make sure that information what travels from your mind to your hands to actually play the patterns. So part 4 is all about putting those principles into practice. And then part 5 that I've been working on like mad over the last several months and am coming upon releasing is really where I think you start cooking with oil, to use that phrase. I think personally, part 5 is what I was looking for all along. I jumped into chords because it's like, oh, it's fun to play chords for my personal journey in music theory. I jumped into chords initially because I was like, that's where it's at. I had no idea that the logic behind combining chords in different ways was so structured and so meaningful. And so I had to like retrace my steps or backtrack to understanding, okay, in order to understand chords, I have to know notes and intervals at the atomic level, because music is fractal in that the ideas and the relationships at the most basic atomic level at the notes and intervals make their way and present themselves and influence the way that chords are constructed. And as you get into chords and progressions, all of this information like makes this meaningful. And then as you start to combine those things, I skipped time because it is more skippable. In part 4, you start to apply these concepts in layers and start to make sense of progressions and start to like I say, apply these principles. And then part 5 is like, I don't want to be bombastic and say it's the Holy Grail, but it's kind of like the Holy Grail of music theory. And that's why I'm so excited and have been working on it so hard, because it needs to be clear because it's so important, these principles. So I would say this is kind of a very, well, not kind of, it's a very long answer to a short question. Definitely practice to get a feel for notes, intervals, and patterns. Definitely practice the stuff in lesson 1. And then if you want to get into chords and get a feel for harmonic relationships that also inform playing, solos and improvising over those chords, you have to understand chords and how chords are constructed. And then even at a higher level, part 5, to be able to really understand how you would move through a song, you have to know 4 and 5 lessons, parts 4 and 5. I know I'm repeating myself and kind of saying it over and over again, but definitely start at lesson 0 and make your way to lesson 20. And don't skip anything. If you skip anything, you can skip part 3. Which is crazy for me to say, because I literally on lesson 10, here, I'll make it red because it was like so hard. Lesson 10 took me 6 months to compose, and I lost 20 pounds in the process. it was crazy. Because I was like, went way deep down the rabbit hole of space and time. It's a pretty heady lesson. And for me to say you could skip it is kind of crazy, because that's like 6 months of my life that went into that. But if you were to skip anything, that would part 3 would be the 3 lessons. Other than that, it's all super essential stuff that really will help you in your process. And yes, Virtuous Heretic, I did forget to eat. It was, they say you can't live on love, and you can't live on time and space either. you need food and water. Actually, speaking of, I have a coffee here that has been sitting here, and we're past the hour, so I guess I'll jump into just consuming this coffee and jumping back into the mode book. And thank you again for being here. Great conversation. Hopefully the answers were helpful in a way. And thank you for your support here, and lots more to come. There's a lot of good stuff. The dam wall is here, and all of this content is the water, and it's going to be coming out. So I'm excited for that. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we will talk real soon. We'll see ya. And I need my glasses to see the cursor. Where's there we go. Cheers.